What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Go ahead, Joe.
Good evening. It is my pleasure to extend a virtual welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. We are so pleased that you could join us for the second of this season's Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. I'm Joy Bivens, Director of the Schomburg Center, where we are and have been for more than 9 decades, dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of global Black experiences. While we certainly wish that we could host you in our building tonight, we are grateful that technology exists that allows us to gather for these important conversations. Public programs are not yet in person, but our exhibitions and research divisions are open and available for your in-person visits. Additionally, you have one more day to tune into the Leftist Center Conference, Pandemic Legacies, Health, Healing, and Medicine in the Age of Slavery and Beyond. You can visit us at schomburg.org to learn more about the conference, our public programs, our research divisions, and our digital collections. The next voices you will hear are those of Dr. Robyn Spencer and Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, co-curators of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, and they're going to introduce speakers for tonight's program, Understanding Policing and Surveillance in America. First, a little bit about our co-curators. Dr. Theoharis is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York, and the author or co-author of 11 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare, and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Dr. Robyn Spencer is Associate Professor of History at Lehman College and the CUNY Grad Center. She is a historian whose research centers on social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spencer.
Thank you, Joy. Such a pleasure to see you and such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I want to start off by thanking Joy Bivens, Novella Ford, and Kalia Bates. It's great to be here. I'm Robyn Spencer, Associate Professor of History at Lehman College. Jeanne Theoharis and Kamosi Woodard started Conversations in Black Freedom Studies in collaboration with the Schomburg Center 9 years ago to create a space where the public could engage with new works in Black social movement history. With fewer and fewer public spaces to engage with new work in Black history, Conversation in Black Freedom Studies was conceived as a way to hear, to learn, and to discuss new work that helps us to see the present more clearly. Kamosi took on a more emeritus status last year, and I'm so thrilled and delighted to be a co-curator this year alongside Jeanne. We're so very pleased that the Schomburg Center has continued this series as one of its educational and public programming offerings. As usual, we'll be here on the first Thursday of every month. Our next program on Thursday, November 4th, is on education as a practice of freedom, featuring Jarvis Givens, Jesse Hagopian, Elizabeth Todd Breland, and Davarian Baldwin.
Thank you, Robyn, and thank you to Joy Bivens again, and Novella Ford and Kalia Bates for all the work putting this together. It is so good to be here. It is so good to be online with all of you for this urgent and timely conversation on the global and historical roots of policing and surveillance in the United States today. We are live streaming this on YouTube, and we will put that link in the chat shortly. So if you want to share that on social media or with friends that might be interested, please do so. Also, we will be dropping in the chat the link to the Schomburg Shop. The books that all of our authors tonight will be discussing are available at the Schomburg Shop for purchase if you don't already have them. Obviously, sadly, we are not in the building, so we will not get them signed, but please go to the Schomburg Shop to buy their books. We are so delighted to welcome tonight's panelists. The first is Victoria Law. Vicky is a freelance journalist, prison abolitionist, and author most recently of Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. Marisol LeBrón is Associate Professor in Feminist Studies and Critical and Ethnic Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz and the author of Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico. Stuart Schrader is Research Professor at the Center for Africana Studies and the Associate Director in the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University, and the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. And finally, Daniel Chard is Visiting Assistant Professor of History at Western Washington University and the author of Nixon's War at Home, the FBI, Leftist Guerillas, and the Origins of Counterterrorism. So welcome all of you. Welcome to our audience. Again, please feel free to we're gonna be having some questions to begin and then we'll turn to audience Q&A, but please feel free to put questions either in the Q&A function or in the chat for our panelists. So I think where we wanna start out tonight is sort of a more personal question. And for each of you briefly to sort of talk about your journey to this research, sort of your commitments or concerns or what brings you to the research you're going to be talking about tonight. And again, a brief summary of your journey. And Marisol, why don't you start us off?
Great, thank you so much. And I just want to say it's such an honor and pleasure to be here sharing space with you all. And thank you so much for the invitation. So how I came to this project, Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico, was really trying to answer this question about what is the current colonial relationship between the US and Puerto Rico? How do we understand it in a context in which a lot of people would claim that we are in a post-colonial world, right? Or that the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico is one that has been decolonized since the 1950s. And for me, looking at policing became an object in which to understand the ramifications and realities of colonialism as it impacts Puerto Ricans to this day, particularly those who are in the most vulnerable positions within Puerto Rican society. So low income Puerto Ricans, Black Puerto Ricans, immigrant populations, queer folks, and so on. So that was really the kind of catalyst of this project for me, to try and get a grasp on how policing has emerged in Puerto Rico as a mode of colonial crisis management. The other thing that brought me to this project was also trying to really disabuse people of the idea that Puerto Rico is a racial democracy, right? That we come from these three roots, we're all mixed race, right? There's no racism in Puerto Rico because of that. And really, when you look at policing, you see the ways in which race is constantly reified and remade in Puerto Rico to subjugate the island's dark-skinned and Black populations, and to reinforce this idea of Blackness and criminality being linked with one another, right? And so I look at examples from the 1990s to the present to really show the scope of that history.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I came to Badges Without Borders somewhat circuitously and unexpectedly. And what the book is about is, in a word, the relationship of domestic US police power to overseas US warfare, counterinsurgency, and intelligence gathering. But originally, when I started this work, I thought I was interested in kind of a conventional urban studies type of analysis of gentrification. But that was during the Bloomberg years in New York City, when stop and frisk was an inescapable, feature of life in the city. I grew up during Giuliani time. So I was aware of the kind of overwhelming power, the omnipresence of police. And I felt like police were kind of the elephant in the room in studies of gentrification. So I was leaning more towards studying police. But I was also interested in US foreign policy, interested in US empire. And I was inspired and influenced by radical critiques of US empire from the 1960s and 70s by the Black Panther Party or the North American Congress on Latin America. And I guess I would say that my work, takes cues from these organizations and draws on their analyses about U.S. empire, about its effects domestically, their critiques of policing. And what I was able to do in my research was really substantiate and develop further some of the insights at the time, because I had access to declassified records that activists and scholars in the 1960s and 70s didn't have access to. So I was able to, develop those insights, but bring them in new places, drawing on historical records that weren't available at the time. And that's what I've done in the book.
Everyone, thank you for having me. I came to looking at prisons and mass incarceration quite by accident. It started when I was in high school. I went to what we would now call a school to prison pipeline school. I also grew up in Giuliani, New York in the 1990s. And it was a school that was largely Black, brown, and immigrant. People who had families who had more resources would lie about where they lived so they could send their kids to better funded schools. It was a perfect recruiting ground for gangs, and many of my friends joined gangs, dropped out of high school, got arrested, and got sent to Rikers Island. Those of you who are in New York know that we have an island that is dedicated to jails in New York City. And that was the start of my learning about incarceration, was my friends going to jail and then later to prison, and me visiting them and keeping in touch with them while they were locked up. Fast forward a few years and I went to college. I went to Brooklyn College, where Jeanne Theoharis teaches. I was fortunate enough to take several classes with her. And I did an independent study where I looked at what post-1970s prison organizing looked like. And at the end of this independent study, I realized everything that I had was about men. And I thought, well, where are the women? At the time, there were maybe 90,000 something women behind bars in the United States. And so Jeanne said, well, this is going to be the subject of your next independent research project, which she said to me when I was 8.5 months pregnant and ready to drop a baby. But she encouraged me to do this work, and I did it. And it started me on my life's trajectory of looking at not only issues of mass incarceration, but mass incarceration through a lens of gender and resistance, not just there are women in prison, there are women in jails, but also what does organizing and resistance look like for different populations, for women, and later for trans women, and for other types of people who are often left out of this. And today, it translates to looking at me examining what is happening inside jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers nationwide, and then also whose voices and actions are constantly being left out of these discussions.
Well, like my colleagues, I would like to thank you all and say that it's truly an honor to be with you sharing this forum. So thanks. My book is called Nixon's War at Home, examines how the Nixon administration and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, responded to urban leftist guerrilla groups that came out of the larger Black Power movement and New Left and anti-war movement, groups like the Weather Underground and Black Liberation Army. How did I come to this? Well, it came through my own background in the late 90s and early 2000s in various movements, the animal rights and environmental movement, the global justice and anti-war movement. And I was also involved in doing support work for political prisoners. Free Mumia Abu Jamal was one of the first things I got involved with, but also people who had been involved in some of these urban guerrilla struggles of that period and later into the 80s and were incarcerated or had been incarcerated and released as a result. So when I went back to school to finish my undergrad at University of Southern Maine in 2006, I was interested in studying these groups, and then I ended up going to graduate school at University of Massachusetts. And a question was, how did these leftist guerrilla groups influence American politics beyond the radical left? And in starting to research this and looking at declassified FBI documents and other things, one of the things I realized was that an unintended consequence of this conflict that these guerrillas came out of and participated in was the development of something that would come to be known as counterterrorism.
Thank you. So this is the part of our conversation where each of you get to teach us something. And in some sense, give us a window into your work, maybe telling us kind of one part of your research and maybe one or two of the new ways that your research sort of brings us into thinking about the history and contemporary realities of policing and surveillance in the United States. And Vicki, we're going to start with you.
Sure. So as I said, when I started this research, there were about, there was like something like 90,000 women behind bars. And what I learned is that even though women make up a fraction, something like 1/10 of the prison population at any given time, the rate of women's incarceration has risen dramatically. It's risen more than 700% since 1980. And this is not necessarily because women have gotten more violent or dangerous or, have become greater threats to public safety, but because the ways in which policing and surveillance have happened have expanded and grown to catch more people in the net, particularly people who are at the margins and who are the people who are always policed, surveilled, and punished. And then when I was looking at organizing and resistance in women's jails and prisons, what I had to understand was that you couldn't apply a male lens to this work. So you might say, why aren't women having hunger strikes? Why aren't women having riots? Why aren't women doing all of these actions that typically happen inside men's prisons and are the acts that draw public attention and public scrutiny to prison conditions or jail conditions? And while it's true that women in prison do riot, they do have hunger strikes, they do have work strikes. One time they rioted because they couldn't see their children at Christmas, and that happened in the 1970s. A lot of times their priorities are different than their male counterparts because of the way society genders people's roles. For instance, parenting. The majority of people in prison are parents, but when fathers go to prison, their loved ones, often their female loved ones, their wives, their mothers, their girlfriends, their ex-wives, their sisters will take care of their children. And when a mother goes to prison, her children are 5 times more likely to end up in foster care than those of incarcerated fathers. So organizing to be able to keep in touch with your children, to be able to make sure that you know where they are at all times, to not lose your parental rights, because in 1997, Congress and then President Clinton signed the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which stated that if a child spends 15 of the past 22 months in foster care, the state should start terminating parental rights. That became a very gendered issue in prisons because of whose children went to foster care. Similarly, with domestic violence and incarceration, there's now what we call an abuse to prison pipeline, which is usually talked about when we talk about women in prison. But back in the 1990s and early 2000s, this was not necessarily a recognized prison issue, even though something like over 90% of women in prison have experienced gendered violence before their arrest and incarceration. So again, these were ways in which we had to look at what was happening inside women's prisons and what their priorities are. So their priorities might not necessarily be exploitative work conditions. That might be number 5 on their list of priorities, but their list of priorities might be, I want to be in touch with my children. I don't want to lose custody of them. I am trying to heal from trauma, from suffering gendered violence. And if your priorities are different, your ways of organizing might look very different. So as I mentioned before, there was a Christmas riot in which women rioted about not having access to their children at Christmas. But more often, organizing and resistance might look like women sitting in the law library and helping other women with their family law cases, educating each other about what does this piece of paper mean? Or what do you need to do to prove to a judge that you are not a bad mother simply because you are in prison, and you should not lose custody of your children forever and ever. It might look like working with advocates and legislators to pass laws that pause that kind of the Adoption Safe Families Act timeline, so that way, not only do you not lose your child, but other women or other parents are not subject to that same draconian timeline. So these are the kinds of things where, if we're looking at prisons or policing or surveillance, and we look at whose voices are missing and whose experiences do we need to include, we can expand and really see how these systems impact people and then what needs to be done about them.
Thank you. So Nixon's war on home has two big arguments that I've come to through looking at FBI documents, government sources, and published oral histories of leftists and of FBI agents and memoirs. So one is that counterterrorism has a history before 9/11, but specifically kind of the template for a lot of the counterterrorism and war on terrorism we saw after 9/11, and is really forged in the 1970s. It's during this period where American political leaders and leaders of the FBI are shifting national security priorities from anti-communism to anti-terrorism. The FBI under Director J. Edgar Hoover begins to revive illegal surveillance tactics like warrantless wiretapping and break-in that had been used earlier against the Communist Party, but actually banned during the mid-60s by Hoover. Developing new policing tactics. There's development of mass surveillance of political and racialized suspect communities. The latter are specifically referring to people of Arab descent. Part of the development of counterterrorism is that it was always political. It was part of this punitive turn, what scholars in our field here, like the colleagues have referred to as a punitive turn. American society was already punitive before, but there's a shift here from moving priorities away from the limited social democracy of the Great Society and the New Deal towards a rise of mass incarceration. And while underlying problems of racism and policing, of imperialism and other state violence remain, and economic inequality remain unaddressed, the counterterrorism during this time was limited in its effectiveness in reaching its own goals, and sometimes even counterproductive, but led to a host of unintended consequences. And one of them brings me to the second argument, which is that this conflict of guerrilla violence leads to an institutional conflict within the FBI and between the FBI and the Nixon administration that leads to the Watergate crisis. And it's a part of the background to the Watergate crisis that brings down the Nixon presidency that we haven't been previously familiar with. Some of the flashpoints in this institutional conflict include in March 1970, when members of the Weather Underground accidentally blow up 3 of their own members in a townhouse in Greenwich Village. Another is when the young radical Jonathan Jackson carries out a raid to free Black revolutionary prisoners in Marin County Courthouse. And the same month, August 1970, several white anti-war radicals carry out a bombing in University of Wisconsin that accidentally kills a physicist. Another flashpoint is the emergence of the Black Liberation Army in New York City in May 1971, beginning a campaign of assassination of police officers. And another is the Black September Palestinian Nationalist Commando Unit's siege on the Israeli men's Olympic team in the 1972 Munich Olympics. So this institutional conflict leads Nixon to form the Plumbers to do dirty, and which are his own team of secret operatives that get caught breaking into the Watergate apartment complex, and leads to this fall of the Nixon presidency. But counterterrorism is more of the lasting legacy.
So what I try to do in the book is trace the rise of punitive governance in contemporary Puerto Rico. And there's this way in which something I was really conscious about trying to avoid with the book was having this like super top down, really bleak narrative, right? I think there's a way in which it's really easy to see the carceral state as this kind of behemoth, right? Because it's so entrenched with so many aspects of our lives in a lot of ways, right? And particularly policing, right? There's a way in which policing functions without the police, right? And there's ways in which we all engage in forms of policing. So I wanted to really focus in the book also on the ways in which, ordinary, everyday Puerto Ricans are doing really extraordinary things to push back on the ways in which these punitive logics and practices are entrenched in everyday life. And so one of the outcomes of, trying to highlight, I think, those stories, was really a takeaway for me from the book, and hopefully a takeaway that readers get, is that, invest in communities, listen to communities, communities know what they need to address the problems that they're facing, right? And so one of the examples that I focus on, and it's the last chapter on the book, because I tried to end on a kind of like more optimistic note, is the example of Theoharis Salud, which is a feminist public health organization in Puerto Rico. And I'll drop the link in the chat when I'm done. But what they do is they create this program, and they're based in Loíza, which is a predominantly Black, low-income, economically marginalized area in Puerto Rico, kind of right outside of the metropolitan area. And they've had a lot of police violence, right? And so the police go in there supposedly trying to deal with gangs and drugs. And when they go in there, they are incredibly violent. There's a lot of examples of racist violence in particular towards residents. And so when the community was facing this crisis with young men in the community who were joining these local youth gangs, Corillos, and dying, right, as a result of these kind of territorial kind of conflicts, they decided that Theoharis Salud, in communication with other residents of the community, decided to not necessarily involve the police. They were like, when we involve the police, things seem to get worse. Typically they come and they flood the area. It feels like we're under siege. And the deaths have not stopped, right? Despite the fact that the police have occupied that area numerous times under the guises of crime and drug control, right? So what they do is they actually create this mediation program that is based on the ceasefire model that comes out of Chicago. So the Acuerdo de Paz program, and they actually just talk to the people in their community that are involved with the Corillos, right? And these are, they start from the premise that no one is disposable and that these are community members that they want here and alive, right? And so this becomes incredibly important in a context where in Puerto Rico, young Black men are considered disposable, right? Loíza is a community that is considered not only disposable, but a danger to the rest of the archipelago, right? And so they reject that logic and they talk to these young people and they ask, what's happening in the community? What's causing this violence? And when they talk to them, they realize, unlike what the police are saying, it's not drugs, it's not, it's these kind of territorial battles that are emerging from this really toxic, possessive form of masculinity. And so they actually do not only direct mediations when conflict is about to happen to stop and intervene instead of calling the police, but they also work with the young men to really do workshops that reconstitute their ideas of masculinity as linked to violence, right? As power, of accessing power through violence, right? And so this becomes incredibly important for them as a feminist public health organization that in their work, right, with these young men, they're interested in addressing these gender dynamics that are causing these disruptions in their community that the policing can never address that, right? Because policing actually participates in that. So there's a way in which what we see with the example of Theoharis Salud in this incredible program where at a time, when they're running their pilot program in 2011, the rest of Puerto Rico experiences tremendous increase in homicides and violence. It's actually one of the bloodiest years in contemporary Puerto Rican history. And Loíza experiences a 50% drop in homicides that year, right? And so Theoharis Salud is not solely responsible for that drop, but it's hard to ignore the fact that they actually worked with the community to figure out what the community needed and how to address these issues, and that they decentered policing in doing that and achieved incredible results. So for me, that's one of the biggest outcomes that I hope people take away from my work.
So I think the primary takeaway of Badges Without Borders is that not only has U.S. empire and U.S. war making overseas, reverberated domestically to shape our police systems, but actually our police systems have been designed and developed for deployment both at home and abroad simultaneously. And the argument I make is that the mission that unites the two, meaning home and abroad, is what I would call counterinsurgency. And this is a term that has its origins in the late 1950s, and it really comes to be adopted in the early 1960s with the foreign policy commitments of the John F. Kennedy administration. And what I take them to mean when they're saying that word counterinsurgency is that they're really thinking about prevention. They're forward-looking, they're trying to come up with a preventative or preemptive approach to political mobilization, which puts police at the center to keep rebellion from breaking out, to keep rebellion from turning into revolution. And of course, this is the height of the Cold War. The fear is of communist revolution around the globe. So the thing that I learned in the course of this research was that the Kennedy administration created what it called the Special Group for Counterinsurgency. And that group oversaw these types of efforts all around the globe, dozens of countries. And the CIA is involved here, the Department of Defense is involved here, but there's a hidden kind of forgotten player in all of this, which was called the Office of Public Safety, or OPS. So what was OPS? I didn't really know before I started this research, but I discovered that OPS is the Foreign Police Training and Assistance arm of the US government. It trained and equipped and assisted police around the globe in over 50 countries. And the people who operated OPS were the most kind of well-regarded, well-known, widely respected police experts in the United States. These are the guys who are writing the police textbooks. They're working closely with prominent police chiefs, in Chicago and Cincinnati, and they travel around the globe plying their trade of teaching counterinsurgency. And what was so interesting for me to learn is that not only were police considered to be central to the mission of counterinsurgency, to all of its phases, but in most cases, these experts who were traveling around the globe, they really believed that the methods that they would have taught police, back home in Chicago or in Baltimore, the tactics, the training, the technologies, this is what they should teach police in other countries. They really used the same type of methods. They had a singular vision rather than a kind of separate domestic vision and foreign vision. The situation for them was really united. And so the people who worked for the Office of Public Safety, they taught, stop and frisk methods. They taught fingerprinting. They taught how to use walkie-talkies. They taught how to do stakeouts, all the kind of basic ideas and practices of policing that were commonplace in the United States at the time, they were using to prevent communist revolution around the globe. And so I think that this can help us to, kind of recognize that the mundane techniques of policing that we see in our cities actually have a kind of counterinsurgent flavor to them. They have a counter-revolutionary approach. They're not necessarily about crime per se. And even, some of the experts I look at, they would say that crime matters insofar as crime is a kind of index of a pre-insurgency situation. They think that crime is kind of incipient rebellion, and that's why they want to control crime. And I think that basically what US empire does is extends this kind of counter-revolutionary stance across the globe. And so for me in my research, the moments where the light bulb kind of went off was when I would see, police experts in their documents, in the documents that they produced, they would mention Harlem, or they would mention Newark in the same sentence as when they mentioned, Caracas or Saigon. It was really one field of vision for them. And that's what I really tried to explore in the book, and try to bring out the full kind of texture and complexity of the way that these police experts enacted this program.
Thank you so much. So before we kind of go on to other questions, we wanted to take a minute for each of you to kind of riff on or respond to what each other has been saying. So is there something in your work that kind of has come up as you've listened to the other panelists? Is there a question? We wanted to have open a space right now for a little bit of kind of collective kind of thinking and conversation. And I'm going to call on Marisol first, just to start us off, and then people can jump in.
Awesome. Well, I've been in conversation with Stuart for a really, really long time. We were actually in grad school together, and we've been thinking together for a long time. So, one of the things that I'm interested in is this question of how do we think about, when we're talking about US policing, what are the places we're talking about, right? And what are the ways in which we need to integrate a kind of global analysis, I think, to really take seriously the ways in which the kind of racist policies that exist here in the United States, right, are tied in with settler colonial methods of social control, right? And so that's something that I would throw out. But the other thing I wanted to think about was actually, Victoria, your work. I've used your work in my teaching and thinking for a really long time. And, one of the things I tried to do in my work, and that I'm moving more towards in my subsequent work, is trying to think about how do we get out of this really androcentric thinking about policing, right? There's a way in which the study of policing is this kind of super masculine space, right? Not necessarily only in terms of, who's studying it, but with the subject and even the framing and thinking, right? It becomes a kind of very masculine ideology towards studying it. So, that how do we kind of integrate that gendered analysis to think about policing beyond kind of, I think, the most obvious kind of examples, right? So there's a way in which gender falls out because the way in which the policing of gender occurs, right, occurs in ways that are a lot less visible, a lot less easy to take up in some ways, right? So those are just two things that, in the conversation, I think also, Daniel, your work speaks to this kind of global element too, right? But that are really sticking with me right now. And I realized I didn't ask a question, but those are my thoughts, so.
Well, I guess I'd love to jump in, and repeat what Marisol said. We've been in dialogue for such a long time, and it's always a pleasure to continue the conversation. And I would just say that, one of the things that I find, and this is not going to be a question either, one of the things I find so impressive about Marisol's work and Vicky's work is, and I haven't read Daniel's brand new book. I can't wait to get my hands on it. Is the way that you have brought together this perspective of everyday people and their struggles to transform these, oppressive institutions and systems. It's really hard. I think that for me, as somebody doing this type of scholarship and trying to understand the police, it's very easy for people in our position to focus on just kind of like one side or the other, the people who are oppressed or the people who are doing the oppressing, and bringing them together and showing that there's actually a really deep interconnection, and that these institutions are responding to movements, and then movements are forced to respond. Everyday people are forced to maneuver in different ways. It's really challenging work to do as writers and thinkers, and I just want to applaud you for this work that you've done, because I think it really points to the way that scholarship can really enrich our understandings. Because if it is just one-sided scholarship, it's a false picture of the world. So
I'd like to jump in so that Vicky Law can have the last word in this section. But what I would say is a couple of things. Before I comment on my co-panelists, I want to give a shout out to to Dr. Spencer first, because it's speaking of someone who's talking about everyday people, the ability to try to make change in Revolution Has Come, which focuses on the Black Panther Party and the women in it, who, as Dr. Spencer has shown, made up a majority of the rank and file in the later years. I cite that in my book to look at how some of the police, some of the examples from oral histories to show how some of the police violence was felt by just like everyday people who are trying to do the breakfast programs. Dr. Theoharis is an outstanding historian as well, but I have to say that the late Dr. Ethan Theoharis was the historian who set the foundation for studying the FBI, and we all owe him a debt. And the world lost Dr. Theoharis recently, and so my condolences to everyone in the family. But I really was let's see, everyday people's ability to make change, and showing how a group like Taher Salud has the ability to actually make a tangible difference. I think those are important, and this idea of synthesis, of looking at the state and everyday people and their movements trying to make change. I first encountered Vicky Law's first book. I'm getting so excited that I'm forgetting the name, but I was really interested because I came out of this through the prisoners' rights movement and looking at the Bedford Hills Rebellion. And your book was really something that was that was really interesting to me. The one thing I'd add, reading Stuart's book, I found it really fascinating when I was looking through FBI documents that the FBI, at least, and the FBI is engaged with all these other police agencies. They're really responding to these insurgent threats, basing their experience with the Communist Party, and also drawing from some of their activities with counterintelligence programs, what we know as COINTELPRO. There is this global sense, and this construction of terrorism is a global process. So it's something I'm interested to continue talking about. And also, that some of the Puerto Rican nationalist movement was also both targeted by the FBI and part of this armed struggle that could be discussed further. So those are some popcorn thoughts.
I guess it's me. One of the things when Marisol was talking earlier was, she said that policing can function even without police. And I think that that's something that we should keep in mind as we move forward when people are talking about defunding or shrinking or eliminating or, fill in word of your choice, policing, is that we should also look at the ways in which the carceral system keeps evolving and changing to address these concerns. So policing can function in, our homes, in our communities, in other institutions that we don't think of necessarily as policing, such as social work, such as, teachers being mandated to report certain things, to like hiring private security officers or having school police in our schools. People may remember that last summer during the city budget, the New York City budget process, there's a call to defund the police by, I think it was like $1 billion. And the city did a whole bunch of shell game maneuvers in which it's like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. We're going to take all of the school safety officers who had been under the New York Police Department budget and payroll and purview but we're not getting rid of all of these school safety officers. We're just moving them over to the Department of Education, but they still serve the same function that they did before of policing students, particularly policing students of color and low-income students and minority students and marginalized students. They just get a different name on the paycheck. So I think that we need to be wary of this idea that, you know, we get rid of the people with badges, or we shrink those departments and we're all good. And instead we need to also challenge the ways in which the carceral state expands, you know, and brings with it that same logic of surveillance and policing and punishment into our homes and communities and, you know, institutions that we think we, you know, are supposed to be helpful. And then I also really appreciated what Stuart said about crime, you know, being seen as this indicator of insurgency, not crime as an indicator of violence or crime as an indicator of harm, but, you know, like what, you know, like how do we control people? And that ties to what, you know, Daniel was talking about with Nixon's, you know, war on the left, you know, like how do we rebrand, you know, insurgents to make them dangerous? How do we rebrand them so that way we conflate people's ideas about fights for liberation with people's fear for their safety? And, you know, like, and that ties into a lot of the myths that, you know, like I write about in Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration, where all of these ideas about safety and, you know, crime prevention and, you know, like harm and violence prevention position the police and prisons as the only solution. And when we do that, then that means that people keep looking for the solutions that look very much like the failed solutions that we have. Whether it's, you know, okay, we shipped out of the bad police state to the nicer school safety officers. We shift from the bad police state to the social workers who now have the ability to, you know, take away your children because you are unfortunate enough to live in a building where your landlord doesn't provide heat and hot water during the coldest months of the year. We shift these things away, but we don't eliminate this logic of surveillance, policing, and punishment.
Thank you. Thank you. It was so wonderful to hear all of your thoughts in conversation. I think I took down so many takeaways from what you were saying: empire, gender resistance, organizing, colonialism, and ongoing struggles. I love being in this position. I'm asking you the last question from the organizers, after which we'll open it up to the audience. So if there's audience members in earshot, and I know that you're listening from all around the world, if you can, and all around the country, if you can put your questions in the chat or Q&A function, we'll be able to scoop them up and pass them on to the panelists. I get to ask the question that everyone wants to know, really the question of situating your work on policing and surveillance into the context of this moment in American national life, right? The police murder of George Floyd and the uprising that followed transformed the national conversation about policing and surveillance. How does your research provide a way to see the present more clearly?
Thank you for that question. You know, part of my approach to this work is trying to understand social movements, tactics, and strategies. And one of the reasons why police are still killing people with impunity in America is because, unfortunately, despite some serious victories, the broadly conceived left and left movements of the 1960s, 70s eras were not successful in eliminating what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the three evils of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. And there are many reasons for that. One is that it's a monumental task. Another is because of dealing with state violence. But sectarianism is also an issue. And I think it's important to look critically at movements, because despite lots of sacrifice and hard work, some of the moved toward by the paramilitary left, groups like the Panthers, and also the urban guerrilla left, embrace of guns, not just for self-defense, but armed insurgency, had some put some limitations on the ability to build coalitions, build constituencies, and in some cases played into some of the law and order politics from the right that emerged. There's also some myths about the FBI that continue to circulate that I try to address in the book. But one of them is that police repression is always necessarily a reflection of a group's political effectiveness. And with the story of the Panthers and Students for Democratic Society and the urban guerrilla groups that come out of that, what I try to document very closely is a more complicated story about these groups forming in part in response to state violence, the war in Vietnam, the problem of violence in Black communities and against political protests. And then at the same time, the embrace of there's this interplay between the FBI giving local police the green light and sometimes instructions on how to go after these movements, and then the embrace of guns leading to escalation of some of the state violence. Another thing I'd say is that counterterrorism has always been political. There are some great questions about it in the feed that we can get to, but it really emerges in a certain political context in the 1970s where this certain type of violence is framed as terrorism, and it has remained highly political since then. And we could talk more about that later.
Well, I think I'd like to pick up on a line of thought that Vicky introduced, which is about the uprising and why it occurred and what the responses are. I mean, I think we need to grapple with the scale and intensity of the uprising in 2020 and why it occurred. Certainly, the pandemic, anger at the Donald Trump administration played a role, but I think we also need to analyze the protests in the context of the prior round of Black Lives Matter protests in 2014, 2015, and the response to those of police agencies across the country. Also the response by liberal elite media outlets, many academics, and of course the Obama administration. For the most part, there was widespread agreement by all of these different players that there should be a kind of commitment to very incremental police reform, mostly along the lines of what we could call procedural justice, meaning a focus on police procedures, fixing police procedures, not fixing the ultimate outcome. So that meant a focus on things like body-worn cameras, a focus on new types of training for police. And guess what the result was? Well, after the killing of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Akai Gurley, Freddie Gray, Corinne Gaines, and many, many others, well, the number of people that police kill actually increased since that time, even according to the really terrible, incomplete data that police provide themselves. So the reform efforts that were produced, again, under the stewardship of the Obama administration and others, they were designed to pacify the rebellions that were happening, to kind of bring, opportunities for change to kind of derail them. And I think that once we understand that these reform efforts didn't actually do anything to, change the lethality of police, but actually had an intention more of pacifying rebellion, it then leads us to say, well, guess what? It actually didn't work, because the largest rebellion in U.S. history happened in 2020, in large part, because people were so radicalized and angered by the failures of these police reform efforts to actually create more just forms of policing. So I think that, just to wrap up my point here, I want us to think about reformism as a big part of the problem. And in my book, I analyze reformism as a key part of this project of disseminating U.S. police expertise around the world. And in order to pacify rebellion in the 1960s, the thought was that we meaning police experts, can introduce new reforms, and that will do the trick. And of course, it didn't do the trick, and lethality continually increased. And so in that way, not much has actually changed since the period I look at in my book.
So picking up a little bit actually from Stuart's last comment, which is, I think there is a way in which we have to think about the protests in 2020 as cumulative, right? As not existing in a vacuum, but really building from the protests in 2014 and 15, right? That there's a synchronicity and a building and almost like a pedagogical kind of way in which there's education that popular education that happened as a result of those protests in 2014 and 15 that we saw kind of emerge then in 2020, right? So I think that's really crucial. And so I think when we think about those kind of two flashpoints in conversation, we can think about the ways in which the conversation that gets highlighted is really around expanding highlighting one, the deadliness of policing, right? So one, shattering any kind of notion of safety and justice being afforded as a result of policing, particularly for Black communities and other communities of color in the US. But the other thing that helped us to do is actually think about police violence in much more capacious ways, right? And so this is something that's definitely borne out in my research in Puerto Rico. And so we see this kind of emerging conversation that is really pushing for a reconceptualization of police violence beyond the nightstick, beyond the fist, beyond the boot, beyond the taser, beyond the gun, right? That those are not the only ways in which we should think about the violence that police perpetrate and facilitate, right, in vulnerable communities. And so this is something that, Stuart's talked about a lot in his work around the violence of police discretion, right? So what laws they enforce and what laws they don't enforce, and the kind of reasons in which they do that. And so in my research, for instance, during the 1990s, one of the things that I show in the book is that actually police allowed homicides to increase as a form of crime prevention, right? Because the idea was that drug dealers, who were the dangerous population, would kill each other off, right? And so there was a tolerance of increased homicides as long as they were occurring in areas considered to be part of the drug trade, right? Which were always public housing, low-income communities, and informal kind of communities, right? So the police tolerated those deaths. They decided not to enforce certain kind of laws, right? They used their discretion to ignore that, right? And so that decision is a form of police violence, right? The police didn't pull the trigger, right? But they allowed for that violence. They facilitated, they created the conditions for that violence to occur. Something else that feminist organizers in Puerto Rico right now are talking a lot about is the crisis of femicides in Puerto Rico, right? And the ways in which that is also a result of police discretion because they're so implicated in gender-based violence in Puerto Rico, right? So they don't enforce, they don't provide any kind of protection, right? And they can't because they're so implicated in that gender violence, right? So I think for me, that's something that has emerged from these flashpoints of, the protests around Ferguson and then the 2020 protest that is really crucial in shifting the conversation, right? Because what we get left with when we think about these really narrow conceptions of police violence is body cams, is disarming the police, but not necessarily taking away the other vast amount of discretionary power that the police have to enact a multiplicity of violence against vulnerable people.
Thank you, everyone, for all of that. Again, I want to stress that, policing and surveillance and prisons, and all of these forms, the carceral state, shapeshifts in response to these demands, as Daniel, Marisol, and Stuart have all pointed out. Like, oh, you want accountability? We'll give you body cameras. Oh, you want, you want us to provide, we understand there are more mentally ill people in prisons these days. We'll build a mental health jail. So I think we need to really remember that a lot of things that are posited as reforms are not necessarily reforms. It's just the carceral state, transforming itself to meet those demands without actually substantively transforming itself. And it still replicates that same logic of surveillance and punishment, and this can also be gendered, like in many ways. Like, we also need to think about how other people are experiencing policing, people of other genders. Marisol talked about how in Puerto Rico, the police are not, stopping gender-based violence, just as in, like the 50 United States and all of the other U.S. territories, police are not stopping gender-based violence, despite, all of these laws on the books that say thou shalt arrest people, when there's a domestic violence disturbance, despite the Violence Against Women Act, which poured billions of dollars into policing and imprisonment and very little money, into things like housing and childcare and things that would help survivors of violence actually be able to get out of abusive and dangerous situations and be able to rebuild their lives. And I just finished a story set on a Native reservation in Washington State where, for listeners who don't know, people who are not Native who commit crimes on Native reservations cannot be prosecuted or arrested by tribal police or tribal authorities. It goes to the federal authorities instead, who are very well known for not doing very much when crimes occur on Native territories. And this includes crimes against women and violence against women. So there's a huge number of Native women who experience violence from people who don't live on the reservation, who come from outside, and act with that kind of impunity because they know that the police do not care, the prosecutors do not care, and they do not face these kinds of sanctions. So we also need to remember that police enact violence against people, and they also don't keep vulnerable and marginalized people safe from violence. And finally, my work really looks at prisons as another form of state violence that doesn't get, the kind of attention that some police murders get. I don't want to say that everybody's, death at the hands of police gets the same amount of attention, because we all know that's not true. But when people are arrested by police and put through this violent, chaotic situation, torn away from their communities, even if it's just for 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, a year, etc., that itself is another form of state violence, and it's a form of violence that doesn't prevent more violence from happening later in the future in that same community, or, even among those same sets of individuals. And it doesn't address root and underlying causes. So, I want to kind of end with Marisol's really amazing example of Taller Salud, in which people came together and said, we don't need to call the police. We don't need to rely on them for our safety. We can figure out ways to produce our own safety. And that's also part of what my work looks at, is other ways to address violence and harm, because I don't want to pretend that we don't have violence and harm in our communities, and in our lives, but constantly building up this policing, surveillance, and prison, mechanisms is not the solution. And if it was, we would be the safest nation in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say the chat has been going crazy since you've been speaking. Everyone is just sort of high-fiving or adding their own opinions and perceptions. So it's been really great to kind of have that interaction. I'm happy to be the mouthpiece for some of the people who are listening. I want to start off with a question coming to us all the way from Thailand. Okay, so Kevan wants to know if one or more of the speakers can comment on the Black sites, not just in Chicago, but in other parts of the US, where police detain suspects. So just take that in, and whoever wants to address that, just jump on in.
Well, I guess I can say one thing about it, which is just that, you know, as even the term black sites, you know, really helps us to make the kind of shift in perspective that I've tried to do in my work, which is to say that what happens with US foreign policy overseas and what happens with, you know, domestic policy and specifically policing, that there actually is a strong connection. And we should, you know, pay a lot of attention to those connections. And so, you know, in the case of the Chicago police torture scandal, which one? Well, the one in the 1970s, the John Burge torture scandal, predominantly in the 1970s. You know, the leader of that effort of really vicious torture. You know, there's strong evidence that he learned some of his techniques as a soldier in Vietnam. And then the black site and you know, torture scandal that continued in the post 9/11 moment in Chicago. We now know that, you know, one of the people involved in this had experience, a Chicago police officer had experience in Guantanamo as an interrogator. So, you know, these kind of like, you know, to use this word that others of you have used, flashpoints, you know, with these kind of moments of connection that I think kind of reveal the bigger picture. And there's a lot of, you know, I'm far from an expert on Chicago. There's a lot of great work on some of this that I would recommend. There's a new book called Reign of Terror by Spencer Ackerman that's about the post 9/11 moment. He's the person who broke the black site story in The Guardian originally. And then there's a book about the John Burge torture scandal that recently came out called Beyond the Usual Beating by Andrew Baer. That's a really fantastic book as well. So, you know, not to add to the list of books to read after this panel, but there's a lot of great work happening.
Excellent, excellent. Well, if no one else wants to chime in, Amelia wants to know, how does the policing and counterinsurgency techniques used to combat communism at home and abroad map onto policing and techniques used against Black Americans? What sort of connections can be drawn? Daniel, do you want to add?
Sure, I could say a few things of that. I think that's a great question, and I'm thinking of that while also thinking about some other questions raised here. But I think one thing that's important to realize, this historian Robyn D.G. Kelly was on here on this forum a couple episodes back and was talking about how, you know, Black people were part of the Communist Party and key leaders. And when we talk about the second Red Scare that happens after World War II, the communist leadership and membership is a multiracial working class organization. And another thing is that the FBI adopts counterintelligence, which is covert information warfare, trying to exacerbate, we popularly known as COINTELPRO, although there was multiple domestic counterintelligence programs. This is originally developed to deal with espionage, but it's to try to create divisions within movements or delegitimize movements. And so that's moved from originally focusing on the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, and to focusing on the Black Panther Party. But there's other ways in which these different kind of policing things overlap. One is that in response to the urban uprisings of the 60s, specifically in Newark and Detroit in 1967, the FBI develops what's called a ghetto informant program. And this is basically turning all Black urban communities in the United States into a suspect community. We are going to try to figure out how to preempt riots or uprisings, civil disturbances in advance by getting all of these informants in all these cities. And actually the program created such a burden for FBI agents that they would make up what they called paper informants. They would just like make up this janitor in Detroit said this and put it in their papers. But that creates kind of a template for the mass surveillance of Arab Americans as racialized suspect communities after the Munich attacks in 1972, which in turn is a template for the racialization of Muslims as suspected Muslims as suspect communities, particularly after 9/11. The other thing I just want to say real quick is like part of what's happening here that facilitates this is constructing this idea of certain violence or terrorism in this period of the 70s.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Carlene, I know has been watching and interacting a lot in the chat. One of the questions that she wanted to ask had to do with popular culture and television. So Carlene wants to know, what do you think about shows like Orange is the New Black and many others? We can name a host of shows. Do these shows normalize the police in the eyes of the public? Can someone take that on?
I don't have a television, so I don't know what is on there. Like my knowledge is limited, but from the television I have seen, it seems like every show, at least on like network television, normalizes the police, from, you know, like all the cop shows, you know, to the, you know, the prison shows, to the prison dramas, to even the nightly news, right? There's always like some, like, you know, like periodically like some feel good story, like 2-minute segment about like the cop that helped the kitten down from the tree, or, you know, like helped a toddler. So I think all of these things combined normalize policing as, you know, like the good thing, which and reinforces this idea that police are good, that they keep us from devolving into chaos, into Mad Max world. And, you know, occasionally they might help your kitten come off of a tree. So we don't, at least, again, maybe people who like have a television and might see more of what's happening on other stations might see something different, but I have not seen, you know, shows that are critical of policing, you know, that have been popular and have really, you know, like put this wedge into American culture. What I see is this cascade of like, you know, cops in Florida, cops in New York, you know, like, you know, here's a drama about cops, here's like a bazillion Law and Orders, and, you know, even shows that are set in prisons that kind of that depict people as, you know, sort of dangerous, scary people that you want to lock away.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else from the TV watching land want to chime in, Marisol?
I was gonna say, because I'm a prolific television watcher. But I do think, you know, Victoria, even without watching all of these shows, right, you're spot on. And so, you know, the term propaganda, right, comes to mind here, right? But this notion that a lot of these shows do exist to kind of normalize this idea of policing and justice or safety being intrinsically linked. But, you know, one thing that you mentioned was you don't necessarily see cops cast in a negative light. And, you know, some of these shows do show that, right? So, you know, you think about these shows that focus on like police corruption or, you know, even cops who kill, right? All of this stuff. But there's a way in which it reinforces that idea that there's a corrective to it, right? That these are individuals who are corrupt individuals, right? It allows a kind of movement away from a systemic analysis of policing, right? In these really interesting ways. The other thing that I was going to say that's really interesting around like all of this, like these true crime podcasts, particularly the ones that are produced by women, is that there is like kind of a weird nascent kind of critique of policing or the failures of policing, to say like the police don't do their jobs, they're not catching these people who are committing these murders, or they're not addressing kind of sexual assaults, right? And there's this kind of citizen investigator trend that's happening on like podcasts and television and stuff like that. But the thing that makes me think of, right, is it is a critique of policing, but it's one that then takes on the role of the police, right? It still says, so I was thinking about, Vicky, your comment earlier, right, about kind of the ways in which we then start to take on that institutional role of policing, even when we get rid of the police, right? There's some of that also that's really emerging in pop culture and some really interesting and problematic ways too, that I think we should be kind of paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the final question of the night, from Mona: is there research on school resource officers, SROs, policing in school and its impact? Can we get inside of the schools and think about how many are encountering schools as that kind of site?
Yes, there's a lot of research, and of course now my mind blanks on like the names of the groups. But here in New York City, there have been like many groups that have been organizing to try to get cops out of schools, or try to try to change the school disciplinary code so that people aren't ending up, students are not ending up funneled into the policing, and legal system for things that used to just be dealt with by schools. Two kids get in a fist fight, you go to the principal's office and he calls your parents. Not two kids get in a fist fight and suddenly there's 5 squad cars and they both end up in handcuffs, and this is not the like outcome that should be happening. Or so if you so off the top of my head, there's Monique Morris's Push Out, which looks specifically at girls and school policing and the racism behind that. In New York, there's Girls for Gender Equity. There's that works around, again, like my lens is more gendered. I'm sure there are places that do it for, all genders. So you could start there. There's also, God, it's like Alliance for something, and now I don't remember the name. I'm sure it will come up like 5 minutes after we end this podcast. But if you look up School to Prison Pipeline, there's a plethora of research already where people are doing research on the relationship between school safety, quote unquote, because school safety does not mean you go and you stop the next mass shooter. It means you police the students that are inside, and you push people out by hook or by crook that are seen as undesirable, and you push them and criminalize them.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on schools as a sort of a carceral site as well?
I was just gonna put a quick plug in for this book that it talks about school resource officers, but also talks about, there's these like hybrid schools that exist, right? For when kids are pushed out of traditional schools that are supposed to be schools that, help them get back into, traditional schools when they've spent time in the juvenile justice system. And so it's this book caught out by a sociologist, Jerry Flores, and he focuses on young women in California who are cycling in and out of what are called these community day schools. And what we see is that these are institutions that are supposed to be, supposedly nurturing and helping students ease back in. And what we see is that they actually deepen these pipelines of criminalization. So, a lot of these systems, again, where, the police might not necessarily be present, right? And once those students have been pushed out, actually function to completely remove and exile students, right? Really impact their kind of educational opportunities and life choices in really significant ways that make it nearly impossible for them to get back into kind of traditional school. So I just want to put a plug in for that book. I found it to be really important. I think, again, a book that shows the kind of gendered impact, right? That focuses on what he calls kind of the trauma to prison, pipeline in the book.
Thank you, Marisol. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Another resource. Definitely, I hope that listeners have been writing down all of these amazing ways to engage with the ongoing work of these authors. I want to extend a thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for sharing your analysis. Thank you for giving us things to take away in our imaginary backpacks as we move on through life, and we can think about how we can rethink policing and surveillance. I want to remind everyone, we ended with a question on schooling, and next time on the first Thursday of November, we'll be talking about education as the practice of freedom, featuring Jarvis Givens, Jesse Hagopian, Elizabeth Todd Breland, and Devarian Baldwin. Please follow us at Schomburg CBFS on social media. Thank you for everyone who attended locally and nationally and internationally. It's been our pleasure to have this very important conversation, and a special warm thanks to our special guests. Thank you.
Thank you.